You know that feeling when you hear a scream and your blood runs cold, when every instinct in your body tells you something is desperately wrong. That's what Amanda Berry's neighbors heard on May 6, 2013, coming from a house on Seymour Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio. A house that had stood there for decades, unremarkable, blending into the working-class neighborhood like any other. But behind those boarded-up windows and locked doors, three women had been living a nightmare that most of us couldn't imagine in our darkest moments. For over a decade, Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Gina DeJesus had been prisoners, chained, starved, tortured, and violated repeatedly by a man who smiled at his neighbors, played bass at local gatherings, and drove a school bus full of children for 22 years. This is the story of the Ariel Castro kidnappings, a case that shook America to its core and revealed just how easily evil can hide in plain sight. May 6, 2013, started like any other Monday in the quiet neighborhood on Cleveland's west side. Kids were playing in the streets, people were coming home from work, the smell of dinner cooking drifted from open windows. Charles Ramsey, a dishwasher at a nearby restaurant, had just gotten home and was sitting down to eat his McDonald's when he heard something that would change his life forever. A woman was screaming from across the street, not the kind of scream you hear during an argument or when kids are playing too rough. This was different. This was pure desperation. This was the sound of someone fighting for their life. Charles looked up from his food and saw a hand reaching through the bottom of a storm door at 2207 Seymour Avenue. The hand belonged to a young woman, and she was kicking at the door with everything she had, screaming for help. Without thinking twice, Charles dropped his food and ran across the street. Angel Cordero, another neighbor, was already there trying to help. Together, they grabbed the aluminum storm door and pulled with all their strength. The door was locked from the inside, but the woman kept kicking, kept screaming, kept fighting. Finally, the door gave way just enough for her to squeeze through, and she tumbled out onto the porch with a little girl clinging to her. The woman was crying, shaking, barely able to catch her breath. She looked terrified, like she expected someone to drag her back inside at any second. Charles asked her what was wrong, if she was okay, if she needed help. She just kept saying the same thing over and over. "Call 911. Please call 911. I'm Amanda Berry." At first, Charles didn't understand. Amanda Berry. That name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. The woman grabbed his phone with trembling hands and dialed 911 herself. What happened next would become one of the most famous emergency calls in American history. "Hello, police. Help me, I'm Amanda Berry," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. The dispatcher asked if she needed police, fire, or ambulance. Amanda's response was clear and urgent: "I need police." When asked what was going on, Amanda said something that seemed impossible. "I've been kidnapped, and I've been missing for 10 years, and I'm here. I'm free now." The dispatcher asked for her address. Amanda gave them 2207 Seymour Avenue, the house she just escaped from. She was actually calling from across the street, from a neighbor's phone, because she was too terrified to stay near that house for another second. She told the dispatcher to send police now, right now, before he comes back. "Who's the guy you're talking about?" the dispatcher asked. "His name is Ariel Castro," Amanda said, her voice shaking. "I'm Amanda Berry. I've been on the news for the last 10 years. She wasn't exaggerating. Amanda Berry had disappeared on April 21, 2003, the day before her 17th birthday. Her face had been plastered on missing person posters all over Cleveland. Her mother had died in 2006, heartbroken, never knowing what happened to her daughter. And now here she was, alive, free, with a 6-year-old daughter who had been born in captivity. When police arrived at the scene just minutes later, they found Amanda outside, still terrified, still shaking. She told them there were others inside. 2 more women, Michelle Knight and Gina DeJesus. Both of them had also been missing for years, presumed dead by many, forgotten by some. Officers rushed into the house at 2207 Seymour Avenue. They moved through the dark, cluttered rooms, calling out, searching. And then they found them. Michelle Knight and Gina DeJesus, both alive, both emerging from the nightmare they'd been living for over a decade. Michelle had been there the longest, 11 years. Gina had been there for 9 years. They were thin, pale, scared. They'd been living in that house, just feet away from neighbors who had no idea. People had walked past that house every single day. Children had played in the street outside. Life had gone on normally while these 3 women suffered unimaginable horrors behind those walls. The news spread like wildfire. Amanda Berry found alive. Gina DeJesus found alive. Michelle Knight found alive. The city of Cleveland erupted in a mixture of joy, disbelief, and horror. Joy that these women were alive. Disbelief that they'd been hidden in plain sight for so many years. And horror at what they must have endured. Within hours, Ariel Castro was arrested in the parking lot of a McDonald's not far from his house. The man who had held 3 women captive, who had brutalized them, starved them, violated them repeatedly, was finally in custody. His brothers Pedro and Ariel Castro were also initially arrested, but they were released after investigators determined they had no knowledge of what Ariel had been doing. This was his crime alone, his secret, his evil. The rescue on May 6, 2013, wasn't just the end of a nightmare for 3 women. It was the beginning of one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American history. 2207 Seymour Avenue looked like every other house on the block. A modest, 2-story home with peeling paint and a small front porch. The kind of house you'd pass without giving it a second thought. The neighborhood itself was working class, predominantly Latino, with families who'd lived there for generations. People knew each other. They looked out for each other. Or at least they thought they did. But there was something off about Ariel Castro's house. Neighbors had noticed it over the years, even if they didn't fully register what they were seeing. The windows were covered, some boarded up from the inside. Castro always said he was doing renovations, that he'd get around to finishing them eventually. He kept his curtains drawn. His doors were always locked, multiple locks on each door. He never invited anyone inside, not even family members. When police finally entered that house on May 6, 2013, they discovered why Castro had been so protective of his privacy. The interior of 2207 Seymour Avenue wasn't just a house. It was a prison, carefully designed to keep 3 women trapped and hidden from the outside world. The front door had multiple locks. Once you were inside, there was another door, also with multiple locks. Castro had installed additional doors throughout the house, each one lockable from the outside, creating layers of barriers between the women and freedom. Even if one of them managed to get past one door, there were others waiting, and Castro kept all the keys on him at all times. The windows weren't just covered. They were boarded up and nailed shut from the inside. Heavy curtains hung over the boards. During the day, very little natural light made it into the house. The women lived in perpetual twilight, never quite sure what time it was, what day it was, what season it was outside. The basement was where it started for all 3 women. It's where Castro initially took them after abducting them. The basement was dark, damp, cold. He would chain them down there at first, sometimes for weeks, breaking their spirits, making them understand that escape was impossible, that screaming wouldn't help, that nobody was coming to save them. Upstairs, on the 2nd floor, Castro had created individual rooms for the women, though calling them rooms is generous. They were more like cells. He kept the women separated for most of their captivity, especially in the early years. He didn't want them forming bonds, supporting each other, planning together. Isolation was part of the torture. The rooms had chains bolted to the walls. Heavy chains, the kind you might use to secure a motorcycle. He would chain the women by their ankles, giving them just enough slack to move a few feet but never enough to reach a window or door. Sometimes he chained them by their necks. Sometimes he used extension cords instead of chains. Binding their hands and feet together and suspending them from the ceiling, leaving them hanging for hours. Castro had covered some of the radiators with wood and padding, not out of concern for the women's safety, but to muffle any sounds they might make. He played the radio loudly to drown out their cries. He told them that if they screamed, if they tried to escape, if they did anything he didn't like, he would kill them. And they believed him because he'd shown them exactly what he was capable of. The bathroom situation was degrading and inhumane. For long periods, the women weren't allowed to use the actual bathroom. Instead, Castro gave them plastic buckets. They had to relieve themselves in buckets, sometimes while chained up, unable to maintain any dignity. The smell in the house was overwhelming at times. When police searched the property, they found evidence of the horrific conditions these women had been forced to endure. Castro had also installed alarms on the doors. If a door opened, he would know immediately. Even when he wasn't home, even when he was at work or out with friends, the women knew that trying to escape would trigger an alarm and bring him running back. The psychological chains were almost as strong as the physical ones. But perhaps the most disturbing thing about the house was how close it was to normal life. Children played in the street outside. Neighbors mowed their lawns right next door. Ice cream trucks drove by in the summer. The sounds of ordinary life filtered through those boarded-up windows, a constant reminder to the women of everything they'd lost, everything they couldn't reach. Freedom was just feet away, and yet it might as well have been on another planet. After the rescue, investigators spent days combing through the house, documenting everything, collecting evidence. They found the chains still attached to the walls. They found the locks, the boards over the windows, the makeshift barriers Castro had constructed. They found diaries the women had kept, documenting their experiences, their pain, their hope that someday someone would find them. The house at 2207 Seymour Avenue became a symbol of evil in Cleveland. People drove by just to see it, to try to understand how something so horrible could have happened there. How had nobody noticed? How had Castro gotten away with this for so long? The answer was chilling in its simplicity. Castro had been careful. He'd been methodical. And he'd hidden his crimes behind the closed doors and covered windows of an ordinary-looking house in an ordinary neighborhood where people minded their own business and trusted that their neighbors were doing the same. On August 7, 2013, just over 3 months after the women were rescued, the house at 2207 Seymour Avenue was demolished. It took less than 90 minutes to reduce it to rubble. Michelle Knight was there that morning. She handed out yellow balloons to the crowd that had gathered, yellow being one of the symbols of the women's freedom and survival. As the excavator tore into the house, as the walls came down and the rooms where they'd suffered were crushed to dust, the crowd cheered. Church bells rang out across the neighborhood. Prosecutor Tim Maginty said it best. This house represented evil incarnate, which is Ariel Castro. Now it is gone. The lot was leveled and seeded with grass. Today, there's nothing there but an empty space. But the memory of what happened in that house, the horrors that 3 women endured behind those walls, that will never be erased. Ariel Castro was born on July 10, 1960 in Dewey, Puerto Rico. He moved to Cleveland, Ohio, as a child with his family, settling into the city's west side in a predominantly Puerto Rican neighborhood. To most people who knew him, Castro seemed like an ordinary guy. A little quirky maybe, a little controlling, but nothing that set off major red flags. Nobody looked at Ariel Castro and thought monster. That's what made him so dangerous. Castro worked as a school bus driver for Cleveland schools for 22 years. Think about that. For more than 2 decades, parents trusted him with their children. He drove kids to school and back home every single day, smiling, waving, making small talk with parents at bus stops. He was certified, background checked, cleared to be around children. And all the while, he was holding 3 women captive in his house, brutalizing them in ways that are almost impossible to comprehend. On the surface, Castro maintained a normal life. He played bass guitar in various Latin bands around Cleveland. His neighbors knew him as a friendly guy who sometimes brought his motorcycle out on nice days. He would wave, chat about the weather, complain about the same things everyone complains about: bills, traffic, the economy. He had children of his own, adult children who had no idea what their father was doing. He attended family gatherings. He played with his grandchildren. He lived a double life with such skill that almost nobody suspected a thing. But there were warning signs, red flags that, in hindsight, painted a very different picture of who Ariel Castro really was. The biggest red flag was his treatment of his wife, Grimelda Figueroa. Castro married Figueroa in 1980, and what followed was decades of horrific domestic violence. According to court records and family members, Castro regularly beat his wife. He broke her nose twice, broke her ribs, fractured her skull, dislocated her shoulders, and knocked out her teeth. He beat her so severely on multiple occasions that she required hospitalization. And it wasn't just physical abuse. Castro controlled every aspect of Figueroa's life. He controlled where she went, who she talked to, what she did. He threatened to kill her if she left him. He threatened to kill their children. The abuse was so severe, so constant, that Figueroa finally left him in 1996 after 16 years of marriage. Even after the separation, Castro continued to terrorize her. In 2005, Figueroa filed for a protective order against Castro, stating in court documents that he had abducted and beat one of their daughters and that he frequently abused the children, both physically and emotionally. She wrote that Castro had broken her nose twice, her ribs, caused a blood clot on her brain, 2 dislocated shoulders, and knocked out her tooth. She said she feared for her life. Despite this documented history of violence, despite the protective orders, despite everything Figueroa had endured, Castro managed to maintain his job as a school bus driver. He was fired eventually, but not until 2012, and not because of the domestic violence. He was fired for making an illegal U-turn with a bus full of children and leaving a child on the bus unattended. That's what it took to finally end his career as a bus driver, not the decades of abuse. Not the clear evidence that he was violent and dangerous, an illegal U-turn. Figueroa died in 2012, 1 year before Castro's crimes were discovered. She never got to see justice for what he'd done to her. She never knew that while he was beating her, terrorizing her, destroying her life, he was also planning and then executing the kidnapping and captivity of 3 other women. Some people believe the abuse of his wife was practice for what he would later do to his captives. Others believe they were parallel expressions of the same deep-seated need to dominate, control, and inflict pain. Castro's adult children were shocked when they learned what their father had done. His daughter, Angie Gregg, spoke publicly about her horror and disbelief. She'd grown up in that house on Seymour Avenue before her parents separated. She'd lived there, played there, slept there. And then years later, her father turned it into a prison. She never suspected. None of his children did. Castro had kept them away from the house in later years, always making excuses about why they couldn't come over, why he couldn't host family gatherings. But there were moments, small moments, when Castro revealed who he really was. His children remember him as controlling and explosive. He had a temper that could ignite over the smallest things. He would scream, break things, threaten. He demanded absolute obedience from his children when they were young. He ruled his household with an iron fist, and everyone lived in fear of setting him off. Castro's brothers lived nearby, but they claimed they rarely went into his house. They'd stop by sometimes, knock on the door, but Castro would come outside to talk to them rather than inviting them in. They thought he was just being private, maybe embarrassed about the state of his house. They never imagined the real reason. Castro's mother, Lillian Rodriguez, lived just blocks away. Castro would occasionally bring Amanda Berry's daughter, Jocelyn, to visit his mother. He told his mother that Jocelyn was his girlfriend's daughter, that the girlfriend was too busy to come along. His mother doted on the little girl, never knowing that she was the child of a woman being held captive by her son. The deception was so complete, so thorough, that even his own mother was fooled. In the neighborhood, Castro was known but not particularly well liked. Some neighbors found him friendly enough. Others thought he was odd, standoffish, suspicious. There were rumors over the years, whispers about strange things happening at his house. Some neighbors reported hearing screams, seeing naked women in the backyard, noticing that Castro would come and go at odd hours, but nothing was ever investigated thoroughly. Police were called to the house on a few occasions, but Castro always had an explanation, and the officers never pressed hard enough. In 2004, a year after Amanda Berry was kidnapped and a year before Gina DeJesus would be taken, police actually visited Castro's house. They were investigating a report about an abandoned child inside. Castro answered the door and denied that there was a child inside. The officers didn't push further. They didn't get a warrant. They didn't search the house. They took Castro at his word and left. At that very moment, Michelle Knight and Amanda Berry were inside, chained and terrified. It's one of the most haunting what-ifs of this case. What if those officers had insisted on searching the house? What if they'd pushed past Castro and looked around? Michelle and Amanda might have been rescued that day. Gina DeJesus might never have been kidnapped at all. But it didn't happen. Castro smiled, lied, closed the door, and went back to his captives. Ariel Castro was a predator who hid in plain sight. He was the friendly neighbor, the bus driver, the musician, the family man. And behind closed doors, he was a monster. He was calculating, patient, and utterly without remorse. He spent years planning his crimes, modifying his house, and creating the perfect prison. And when he finally put his plan into action, he did it with a level of cruelty and brutality that shocked even seasoned law enforcement officers. This is the man who destroyed 3 lives. This is the man who stole years from 3 women who had done nothing to him, who didn't know him, who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. This is Ariel Castro, and his name will forever be synonymous with evil. August 22, 2002, was just another difficult day in Michelle Knight's difficult life. At 21 years old, Michelle had already been through more hardship than many people experience in a lifetime. She'd been in and out of foster care as a child. She'd struggled with her education, dropping out of school. She'd had a son, Joey, when she was young, but she'd lost custody of him due to her unstable living situation. That custody loss devastated her. Joey was everything to her, and she was fighting desperately to get him back. On that August day, Michelle had an appointment with social services. She needed to meet with a social worker to discuss her custody case, to show that she was trying, that she deserved another chance to be Joey's mother. The appointment was crucial. It was one of the most important meetings of her life. Michelle didn't have a car, so she had to rely on walking and public transportation. She set out from her cousin's house in Cleveland's West Side, heading toward what she thought was the social worker's office. But Michelle got lost. The streets in that part of Cleveland can be confusing if you don't know them well, and Michelle wasn't entirely sure where she was going. She walked block after block, growing more anxious with each passing minute. She was going to be late. She couldn't be late, not for this. That's when she saw him, a man she vaguely recognized from the neighborhood. His name was Ariel Castro, and he was the father of one of her friends. Michelle knew his daughter from school. She'd been to his house once or twice years ago, back when she was a teenager. Castro seemed friendly enough, and when he pulled up next to her and asked if she needed help, Michelle felt relieved. Castro said he knew where the social services office was, said he'd give her a ride. Michelle hesitated for just a moment. That instinct we all have that sometimes whispers, "Be careful," but she dismissed it. She knew this man, sort of. He was a father, a bus driver, and she was desperate. She was late. She got in the car. But Castro didn't drive her to the social services office. Instead, he told her he needed to stop by his house first to pick something up. Just a quick stop, he said. Michelle agreed, though unease was starting to creep in. When they pulled up to 2207 Seymour Avenue, Castro told Michelle about some puppies he had inside. Did she want to see them? Come inside just for a minute. Michelle loved animals. The thought of puppies made her smile despite her stress about the appointment. She followed Castro into the house. It was a decision that would cost her 11 years of her life. The moment Michelle stepped inside, everything changed. Castro closed the door behind her and Michelle heard the locks click into place. Multiple locks. Her unease turned to fear. Where were the puppies? Castro's friendly demeanor evaporated. He grabbed Michelle, his grip like iron. She tried to fight, tried to scream, but Castro was stronger. He dragged her through the house and down into the basement. What happened next was the beginning of a nightmare that would last over a decade. Castro tied Michelle up using extension cords, binding her wrists and ankles together so tightly that her circulation was cut off. He used a motorcycle helmet to muffle her screams, strapping it onto her head. Then he attached a chain to the helmet and hoisted her up, leaving her suspended, her feet barely touching the ground. The weight of her body pulled against her wrists, her ankles, her neck. The pain was excruciating. Castro raped Michelle that first day, and then he left her there in the basement, hanging from the ceiling, unable to move, unable to call for help, unable to do anything but endure. He left her like that for 3 days without food, without water, without mercy. During those first days, Michelle thought she was going to die. She prayed for death, actually, because it seemed like the only escape. But something inside her, some deep core of survival instinct, kept her fighting. She thought about Joey. She thought about how much she wanted to see him again, to hold him again. That thought, more than anything, kept her alive. After those first 3 days, Castro established a routine, if you can call something so horrific routine. He would keep Michelle chained up for most of the time, sometimes in the basement, sometimes in a room on the second floor. He raped her repeatedly, sometimes multiple times a day. He beat her when she resisted, when she cried too loudly, when she did anything that displeased him. He starved her, giving her just enough food to keep her alive but never enough to maintain her strength or health. Michelle learned quickly that resistance only made things worse. Castro was unpredictable. Sometimes he would seem almost normal, bringing her food, letting her watch TV. Other times he would fly into rages, beating her until she lost consciousness. She never knew which version of Castro she was going to get, and that uncertainty was its own form of torture. One of the cruelest things Castro did was tear up the photograph of Michelle's son, Joey. Michelle had kept it with her, hidden in her clothing, a small reminder of the life she'd had, the child she loved more than anything. When Castro found it, he ripped it to pieces in front of her, laughing at her tears. He told her she would never see Joey again. He told her that nobody was looking for her, that nobody cared, that she'd been forgotten. And in a way, Castro was right. Michelle's family didn't report her missing right away. She'd been known to disappear for stretches of time before, staying with friends or boyfriends, sometimes being out of contact for weeks. When she didn't show up for her social services appointment, the system assumed she'd just given up on fighting for custody. No one filed a missing persons report. There was no search, no vigils, no news coverage. Michelle Knight simply vanished, and the world moved on without her. That abandonment, that lack of anyone searching for her, was almost as devastating as the captivity itself. Michelle knew that Amanda Berry had been reported missing when she was taken. She knew there were searches, news stories, hope that Amanda would be found. But for Michelle, there was nothing. She'd been erased. Over the years of captivity, Castro put Michelle through unimaginable suffering. He impregnated her at least 5 times. 5 times, Michelle felt the hope and terror of carrying a child in that hellish place. And 5 times, Castro deliberately ended those pregnancies. He would starve her even more than usual. He would punch her in the stomach repeatedly. He would hit her with dumbbells, heavy weights that he'd slam into her abdomen over and over until she miscarried. Sometimes he would slam her against walls so hard that she'd lose consciousness. Each miscarriage was physically agonizing and emotionally devastating. Michelle wanted those bobbies. Even in captivity, even knowing the horrific circumstances, she wanted to be a mother again. She wanted to have something to love, something to care for. And Castro took that from her 5 separate times. The beatings were so severe that Michelle suffered permanent damage. She lost hearing in one ear from the repeated blows to her head. Her facial bones were fractured in multiple places, requiring reconstructive surgery after her rescue. Her body was covered in scars, visible reminders of the torture she'd endured. Castro also killed Michelle's only companion during captivity. At one point, she had a small dog, a pet that brought her comfort in the darkness. But when the dog bit Castro while trying to protect Michelle during one of his attacks, he killed it. He snapped the dog's neck right in front of her, then threw the body away like it was garbage. Michelle was alone again. But Michelle Knight survived. Through all the pain, all the horror, all the hopelessness, she survived. She survived the rapes, the beatings, the starvation, the forced miscarriages. She survived being forgotten by the world outside. She survived because somewhere deep inside, she still had hope that someday, somehow, she would get out. She would see the sun again. She would breathe free air again. And she would make Ariel Castro pay for what he'd done. April 21, 2003, should have been a day of celebration. The next day, April 22nd, would be Amanda Berry's 17th birthday. She had plans, normal teenage plans with friends and family. She was working an evening shift at her Burger King job on West 110th Street and Lorraine Avenue, and then she was going home to finish preparing for her birthday. Amanda was a bright, friendly girl with a smile that lit up a room. She was close with her mother, Lawana Miller, and her younger sister. She had friends, a job, dreams for the future. She was just an ordinary teenage girl living an ordinary life. Amanda's shift ended around 7:30 p.m. She called her sister to see if she could get a ride home. Her sister couldn't make it, so Amanda decided to walk. It wasn't far, less than half a mile to where she was staying with her sister. The weather was decent for late April in Cleveland. Amanda said goodbye to her coworkers, grabbed her things, and started walking. She never made it home. Somewhere between the Burger King and her sister's house, Amanda Berry vanished. Her mother, Lawana, called the police when Amanda didn't come home that night. Unlike Michelle Knight's disappearance, Amanda's was taken seriously immediately. She was a minor, she was reliable, she wouldn't just not come home, especially the night before her birthday. Something was very wrong. The next day, April 22nd, instead of celebrating Amanda's 17th birthday, Lawana was organizing search parties. Flyers with Amanda's picture went up all over Cleveland. The local news covered the story. Police interviewed Amanda's friends, coworkers, family members. Everyone said the same thing. Amanda wouldn't run away. She didn't have problems at home. She wasn't into drugs or hanging with a bad crowd. She was a good kid who'd simply disappeared. What nobody knew at the time was that Ariel Castro had seen Amanda walking that night. He'd been driving around, looking for his next victim. He'd already had Michelle Knight imprisoned in his house for over 7 months. But Michelle hadn't been reported missing. There were no searches, no news coverage. Castro had gotten away with it so completely that he felt confident enough to take another girl. Castro pulled up next to Amanda and offered her a ride. Amanda knew Castro, at least peripherally. He was the father of one of her friends. She'd been to his house before. He seemed safe, trustworthy. He was a bus driver, someone parents trusted with their children. When he offered her a ride, Amanda got in the car. It was a decision that would steal more than a decade of her life. Just like with Michelle, Castro told Amanda he needed to stop at his house first. Just a quick stop, he said. Amanda agreed, not suspecting anything. When they pulled up to 2207 Seymour Avenue, Amanda followed Castro inside. And just like that, the door closed and the locks clicked and Amanda Berry was gone. Castro took Amanda down to the basement where he'd been keeping Michelle, but he kept them separated at first. He didn't want them talking, bonding, planning. Amanda was chained up, raped, and told the same things Michelle had been told. Nobody is looking for you. Nobody cares. Scream all you want, nobody will help you. Try to escape and I'll kill you. But unlike with Michelle, people were looking for Amanda. Her face was everywhere in Cleveland. Her mother, Lawana Miller, became a tireless advocate for finding missing persons. She appeared on local news regularly, begging for information, pleading for Amanda's safe return. She never gave up hope that her daughter was alive, that she would come home. Lawana's dedication touched the hearts of everyone in Cleveland. People joined in searches, distributed flyers, kept Amanda's name in the public consciousness. There were vigils on anniversaries of her disappearance. The community rallied around Lawana and her family, determined not to let Amanda be forgotten. Inside the house on Seymour Avenue, Amanda heard some of this. Castro would sometimes let the women watch TV, and Amanda would see her own face on the news, see her mother pleading for her return. It was torture of a different kind, seeing the pain her disappearance was causing, knowing she was just miles away but unable to do anything about it. For the first few years of captivity, Amanda endured regular rapes and abuse. Castro was slightly less violent with her than he was with Michelle, though that's a low bar. He still beat her, still starved her, still kept her chained for long periods. But there was something about Amanda that Castro seemed to fixate on in a different way. He saw her as his favorite, which is a grotesque thing to say about a captive, but it affected how he treated her. Then in 2006, Amanda realized she was pregnant. The terror she felt is hard to imagine. She was carrying her rapist's child. She was captive in a house where she'd seen Castro beat Michelle into miscarrying multiple times. She didn't know if he would do the same to her, or if he'd let her have the baby, or what would happen. Christmas Day 2006, Amanda went into labor. There was no hospital, no doctor, no medical care of any kind. Castro ordered Michelle Knight to deliver the baby. Michelle, who had been forced to miscarry her own pregnancies, was now being forced to bring Castro's child into the world. The irony, the cruelty of it was devastating. The birth took place in a small, inflatable kiddie pool in one of the rooms. Michelle did her best, despite having no medical training, despite being terrified. Amanda labored for hours in agony, crying for help that wouldn't come. Finally, the baby was born. A little girl. But immediately there was a problem. The baby wasn't breathing. Castro threatened Michelle. He told her that if the baby died, he would kill her. Michelle, desperate and terrified, performed mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on the newborn. She breathed life into that tiny infant, refusing to let her die, refusing to give Castro a reason to kill her. After what felt like an eternity, the baby gasped and started crying. She was alive. Amanda named her daughter Jocelyn, and from that moment on, everything changed for Amanda. She had a reason to survive that was even stronger than her own will to live. She had a daughter to protect, to care for, to love. Jocelyn became Amanda's entire world in that house of horrors. Castro allowed Amanda to raise Jocelyn to keep her close. In fact, he sometimes took Jocelyn out of the house. He brought her to visit his mother, telling her that Jocelyn was his girlfriend's daughter. He took her to the park sometimes. He even brought her to see Amanda's mother once, though Lawana didn't know who the little girl was. Jocelyn called Castro Daddy and his mother Grandma, having no concept that anything was wrong, that her mother was a prisoner, that this wasn't normal. Amanda did her best to give Jocelyn as much normalcy as possible in that impossible situation. She taught her colors and numbers. She sang to her. She protected her from the worst of what was happening. Jocelyn became a reason for all three women to keep fighting. They couldn't let that little girl grow up in captivity. They had to get out, for Jocelyn's sake if not their own. But outside, in the world beyond the boarded-up windows, Amanda's mother was losing hope. Lawana Miller's health deteriorated from the stress and heartbreak of losing her daughter. She developed heart problems. In March 2006, just months before Jocelyn was born, Lawana Miller died at age 44. She died without ever knowing what happened to Amanda. She died believing her daughter might still be alive but never getting to hold her again. When Amanda learned that her mother had died, that Lawana had died still searching for her, still hopping for her return, it broke something inside her. The guilt, the grief, the rage at Castro for stealing so much from her was overwhelming. Her mother had died of heartbreak and Amanda had been just miles away, unable to reach her, unable to tell her she was alive, unable to say goodbye. But Amanda kept surviving. She survived for Jocelyn. She survived because her mother would have wanted her to. And she kept hoping that someday, somehow, she would find a way out. April 2, 2004, was an ordinary Friday for 14-year-old Gina DeJesus. She was a freshman at Wilbur Wright Middle School, a bright, friendly girl who loved spending time with her friends and family. Gina came from a close-knit Puerto Rican family in Cleveland. Her parents, Felix and Nancy DeJesus, were devoted to their children and active in their community. Gina was their world. That Friday, Gina and her friend walked partway home from school together as they often did. But at some point the friend had to turn off to go to her house, and Gina continued alone. It was mid-afternoon, still light out in a neighborhood Gina knew well. She should have been safe. She should have made it home. But Gina never arrived. When she didn't come home by dinner time, her parents immediately knew something was wrong. Gina was reliable. She always came home on time. She wouldn't worry them like this. Felix and Nancy called the police, called Gina's friends, called everyone they could think of. Nobody had seen her. Unlike Michelle Knight, and like Amanda Berry, Gina's disappearance was taken seriously immediately. She was a minor. She was a good kid from a stable home, and she'd vanished without a trace. An Amber Alert, though not issued immediately, eventually went out. Gina's face joined Amanda Berry's on missing person posters all over Cleveland. The DeJesus family became tireless advocates, just as LaWanna Miller had been, organizing searches, speaking to media, keeping Gina's name in the public eye. The DeJesus and Miller families became close during this time. They bonded over their shared nightmare, supporting each other through the vigils and anniversaries and endless waiting. Neither family could have known that their daughters were being held captive just miles away, in the same house, by the same man. What made Gina's kidnapping particularly chilling was that she knew Ariel Castro. She knew him well. Castro's daughter, Arlene, was one of Gina's closest friends. Gina had been to the Castro house many times before the kidnappings. She knew the family. She trusted them. That afternoon, as Gina walked home alone, Castro pulled up beside her. He told her that Arlene was at his house, that they should go hang out. Or, in some accounts, he asked Gina to help him find Arlene, saying his daughter was missing. Either way, Castro used his daughter as bait, exploiting Gina's trust and friendship. Gina got in the car with him, not suspecting anything. Why would she? This was her friend's father. He was safe, or so she thought. Castro drove Gina to 2207 Seymour Avenue, the same house she'd visited before with Arlene. But this time, when she went inside, the door locked behind her and everything changed. Castro grabbed Gina, and she realized with horror that something was very wrong. She tried to fight, but Castro was too strong. He dragged her through the house. For Gina, the betrayal was especially traumatic. This was someone she knew, someone she trusted, Arlene's father. He'd driven them places before. He'd been friendly, normal. And now he was dragging her down to a basement where, unknown to Gina at first, 2 other women were already imprisoned. Castro chained Gina up just as he'd done with Michelle and Amanda. He raped her repeatedly. He beat her when she cried, when she resisted, when she did anything that displeased him. But there was an additional layer to Gina's captivity that made it even more twisted. Castro knew that if Gina saw his face clearly, if she could identify him, it would be dangerous for him. So he often put a bag over her head during the abuse. He wanted to use her, to violate her, but he couldn't risk her being able to definitively identify him if she somehow escaped. Eventually, Castro did allow Michelle and Gina to see each other. He chained them together on the second floor for a period of time. For both women, having another person there, someone who understood, someone to talk to, made a tremendous difference. They weren't alone anymore. They had each other. The 3 women, Michelle, Amanda, and Gina, formed bonds despite Castro's attempts to keep them isolated. They would communicate when they could, share food when they got the chance, offer comfort during the worst moments. They became a family of sorts, united by their shared nightmare and their shared will to survive. Outside, the search for Gina continued for years. Her family never gave up. They held vigils on every anniversary of her disappearance. They spoke at events about missing children. They worked with law enforcement, with media, with anyone who might help bring Gina home. Her mother, Nancy, and her father, Felix, became well-known faces in Cleveland, symbols of parents who refused to let their child be forgotten. The FBI was involved in Gina's case. There were theories, leads, investigations that went nowhere. Some people thought Gina had been taken by a stranger. Others suspected someone she knew. Nobody suspected Ariel Castro, even though police had been to his house, even though neighbors had reported strange things happening there. Castro was hiding in plain sight, and nobody was looking at him. Inside the house, Gina endured the same horrors as Michelle and Amanda: the starvation, the beatings, the rapes, the isolation. She was chained for hours at a time, sometimes days. She wasn't allowed to shower regularly. She used a bucket for a bathroom. She lived in darkness with boarded-up windows blocking out the sun. She was just a teenager when she was taken, and she spent years of what should have been her youth, her high school years, her transition to adulthood, locked in a nightmare. But Gina survived. She thought about her family constantly. She thought about her mother, her father, her siblings. She knew they were looking for her. She knew they hadn't given up. That knowledge kept her going through the darkest times. The three women, Michelle, Amanda, and Gina, survived together. They shared their pain, their fears, their hopes. They talked about what they'd do when they got out, not if but when. They made plans, shared memories of their lives before, reminded each other of who they were beyond this captivity. They refused to let Castro erase them completely. And they waited. They waited for an opportunity, a mistake, a moment when they could escape. They waited for someone to find them, for someone to finally look hard enough to see what Castro had been hiding. They waited, and they hoped, and they survived. Life inside 2207 Seymour Avenue wasn't just captivity. It was a calculated, sustained campaign of physical and psychological torture that lasted over a decade. Ariel Castro didn't just imprison these women. He broke them down systematically, day after day, year after year, using every tool at his disposal to maintain absolute control. The daily routine, if it can be called that, was designed to dehumanize and degrade. The women were kept chained for most of the time, either by their ankles or their necks. Sometimes Castro would use extension cords instead of chains, binding their wrists and ankles so tightly that their hands and feet would go numb. Sometimes he would suspend them from the ceiling, leaving them hanging for hours, the weight of their bodies pulling against the restraints, causing excruciating pain. Food was used as a weapon. Castro would starve the women for days at a time, giving them just enough to keep them alive but never enough to maintain their health or strength. When he did feed them, it was often just scraps, cold meals, or food that was barely edible. The lack of proper nutrition left them weak, making escape even more impossible. Michelle Knight bore the worst of the starvation, especially during her pregnancies when Castro was deliberately trying to cause miscarriages. Hygiene was non-existent for long stretches. The women weren't allowed to shower regularly. Sometimes weeks would go by without access to water for bathing. They had to use buckets as toilets, living with the smell and degradation. When Castro did allow them to clean themselves, it was sporadic and unpredictable, another way of maintaining control. Everything was on his terms, according to his whims. The psychological torture was perhaps even worse than the physical abuse. Castro played mind games constantly. He would tell them that nobody was looking for them, that they'd been forgotten, that their families had moved on. He showed Michelle news coverage of Amanda and Gina, proving that some people were being searched for while she wasn't. He showed Amanda footage of her mother's vigils, making her watch her mother's pain while being unable to comfort her. Castro was unpredictable, and that unpredictability was intentional. Some days he would seem almost normal, bringing them food, letting them watch TV, talking to them like human beings. Other days he would fly into violent rages over nothing, beating them until they lost consciousness. The women never knew which version of Castro they were going to get, and that constant uncertainty kept them in a state of perpetual fear. The rapes were frequent, brutal, and varied. Castro raped all three women repeatedly throughout their captivity. Sometimes it was daily, sometimes multiple times a day. He used assault as a tool of domination, a way of asserting his power and destroying their sense of self. The physical trauma was severe, but the psychological trauma was even worse. Being violated repeatedly, having no control over your own body, being reduced to an object for someone else's use. It destroys something fundamental in a person. For Michelle, the 5 forced miscarriages were the darkest chapter in an already dark story. Each time she became pregnant, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this time he'd let her have the baby. Maybe she'd get to be a mother again. But Castro had no intention of letting Michelle have children. He would starve her even more severely than usual. He would punch her in the stomach over and over with all his strength. He would hit her with dumbbells, heavy weights that he'd slam into her abdomen. He would throw her against walls, kick her, beat her until she miscarried. The physical pain of those miscarriages was agonizing, but the emotional pain was even worse. Each lost pregnancy was another death, another piece of Michelle's soul crushed by Castro's cruelty. She grieved for those bobbies, for the children she'd never get to hold, for the motherhood that was stolen from her over and over again. Amanda's pregnancy was different only because Castro allowed it to continue. When Jocelyn was born on Christmas Day 2006, it added a new dimension to the captivity. Now there was a child in the house, an innocent little girl growing up in hell. The women did everything they could to protect Jocelyn from the worst of it, to give her some semblance of normalcy. But how do you create normalcy in a house of horrors? Castro's treatment of Jocelyn was bizarre and unsettling. He took her outside sometimes, something he never did with the women. He brought her to visit his mother to the park, even drove her past Amanda's mother's house once. He was using Jocelyn as a prop, a way to appear normal to the outside world. Look, I have a daughter. I'm a family man. Nobody suspected that Jocelyn's mother was his captive, that she'd been born in captivity, that this wasn't a normal family situation at all. The women spent their days in darkness and despair. The boarded-up windows blocked out natural light, so they often didn't know if it was day or night. They lost track of time. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. Birthdays passed unmarked. Holidays came and went. The world outside continued on while they were frozen in this nightmare. But they found ways to survive mentally. They talked to each other when they could, sharing stories from their lives before, keeping their identities alive. They made plans for what they'd do when they got out. Michelle talked about finding her son Joey. Amanda talked about introducing Jocelyn to her family, to her sister, to the grandmother she'd never get to meet. Gina talked about hugging her parents again, about going to college, about living a normal life. They kept diaries when they could find scraps of paper and something to write with. They documented what was happening to them, partly as a way to process the trauma and partly as evidence in case they ever got the chance to testify against Castro. Those diaries, found after the rescue, painted a devastating picture of their captivity. There were close calls over the years, moments when rescue seemed tantalizingly close. In 2004, police came to the house investigating a report of an abandoned child. Castro lied and the officers left without searching. At that moment, Michelle and Amanda were inside, probably within earshot. If the officers had insisted on searching, everything would have ended differently. Neighbors heard screams over the years. Some called the police. Some didn't, assuming it was just a domestic dispute or someone watching TV too loudly. In 2012, a woman reported seeing a naked woman crawling on all fours in Castro's backyard. Police were called, but the report wasn't investigated thoroughly. Another missed opportunity. Castro's confidence grew with each close call. He'd gotten away with it for so long that he believed he was untouchable. He continued his normal life, playing in bands, going to family gatherings, walking around the neighborhood like he didn't have 3 women chained up in his house. The audacity was stunning. But the women never stopped looking for a way out. They tested the chains when Castro wasn't around, looking for weak points. They tried to pry boards off windows. They screamed when they thought someone might hear. They never gave up, even when it seemed hopeless, even when years had passed and rescue seemed impossible. Michelle Knight, who'd been there the longest, became in some ways the strongest. She'd survived everything Castro had thrown at her. She'd survived being forgotten by the world. She'd survived the loss of 5 pregnancies. She'd survived beatings that should have killed her. And she was still there, still fighting, still hopping. Her resilience was extraordinary. Amanda found strength in Jocelyn. Every day she got up, every day she survived was for her daughter. She needed to protect Jocelyn, to make sure that little girl had a chance at a real life someday. That maternal instinct gave Amanda a reason to endure anything Castro threw at her. Gina held onto her family. She remembered her mother's face, her father's voice, her siblings' laughter. She knew they were out there searching, hopping, praying. She couldn't let them down. She had to survive so she could go home to them. Together, these 3 women formed an unbreakable bond. They were sisters in suffering, united by shared trauma and shared hope. They kept each other sane when the darkness threatened to consume them. They reminded each other that they were human beings worthy of love and dignity, even when Castro tried to reduce them to nothing. They survived together, and when the moment finally came, they would escape together. May 6, 2013 started like any other day in that house of horrors. The women woke up in their separate rooms, chained as always, waiting for whatever the day would bring. Castro was there that morning, moving through the house, doing his usual routine. But then something different happened. Castro left. He told the women he was going out. This wasn't unusual. Castro often left the house during the day, going to run errands, visit family, or just drive around. The women would be left alone, chained in their rooms, unable to escape even with him gone. The locks, the chains, the boarded windows, they were still there. Castro had designed his prison well. But on this particular day, Castro made a mistake. A small mistake, but one that would end his reign of terror. When he left the house, he forgot to properly secure the interior door between the living room and the rest of the house. The storm door was still locked, the one that led to the outside, but that interior door was unlocked. Amanda Berry, upstairs with Jocelyn, heard Castro leave. She waited, listening carefully for the sound of his car pulling away, for the silence that meant he was truly gone. And then she did something she'd done 1,000 times before. She tested her chains, checking if there was any slack, any weakness. And this time, there was enough give for her to move. Amanda managed to get to the door of her room. Her heart was pounding. This could be it. This could be the moment. She made her way down the stairs, Jocelyn beside her, both of them terrified that Castro would come back, that they'd be caught, that this would all go horribly wrong. When Amanda reached the front door, she found the interior door unlocked. She couldn't believe it. But the storm door, the heavy aluminum storm door that led outside, was still locked. Amanda could see through the glass. She could see the street, the neighbors' houses, the normal world that had been just out of reach for so long. She was so close. Amanda started kicking the door. She kicked with everything she had. She screamed for help. The storm door was locked, but it wasn't as strong as the interior barriers. It had some give to it. Amanda kept kicking, kept screaming, praying that someone would hear, that someone would help. Across the street, Charles Ramsey heard her. He dropped his McDonald's and ran. Angel Cordero heard her too and came to help. Together, these 2 men, these strangers who had no idea what they were about to walk into, pulled on that door while Amanda kicked from the inside. The bottom portion of the door gave way. It was just enough space for Amanda to squeeze through with Jocelyn. She pushed her daughter through first, making sure Jocelyn was safe, and then she followed. After 10 years, 1 month, and 15 days in captivity, Amanda Berry was free. She was crying, shaking, barely able to form words. Charles asked her what happened, if she was okay. Amanda managed to say her name, managed to say she needed police. Charles gave her his phone, and Amanda dialed 911. The 911 call was frantic. Amanda's voice was shaking so badly that the dispatcher had trouble understanding her at first. "Help me, I'm Amanda Berry," she said. When the dispatcher asked what was going on, Amanda's response was shocking. "I've been kidnapped and I've been missing for 10 years and I'm here, I'm free now." The dispatcher asked her to calm down, to tell them where she was. Amanda gave the address, 2207 Seymour Avenue. She told them to send police immediately before he comes back. She was terrified that Castro would return, that he'd find her outside, that he'd drag her back into that house. "Who's the guy you're talking about who took you?" the dispatcher asked. "His name is Ariel Castro," Amanda said, her voice breaking. The dispatcher asked if she needed an ambulance. Amanda said yes, but more importantly, she needed police. And then she said something that would shock the entire city. "There's 2 other girls here too." Police arrived within minutes. Officers rushed to the scene, not entirely sure what they were walking into. Was this really Amanda Berry, the girl who'd been missing for a decade, and were there really other victims inside? When officers entered the house, they called out, identifying themselves as police. Michelle Knight and Gina DeJesus emerged from the darkness. Michelle came rushing down the stairs and threw herself into the arms of one of the officers. "You saved us! You saved us!" she cried. She couldn't believe it was real, that police were actually there, that this nightmare was finally over. Gina was more reserved, still in shock, still processing what was happening. She'd been in that house for 9 years, 9 years of her life stolen. And now, suddenly, it was over, just like that. Police were there. She was going to leave this house. She was going to see her family again. The women were taken to Metro Health Medical Center for evaluation. They were malnourished, dehydrated, showing signs of long-term abuse and trauma. Michelle was in the worst physical condition, bearing the scars of beatings and forced miscarriages. But they were alive. Against all odds, despite everything Castro had done to them, they had survived. News of the rescue spread instantly. Amanda Berry found alive. Gina DeJesus found alive. Michelle Knight found alive. The city of Cleveland went into shock. People who had given up hope, who thought these women were dead, suddenly learned they'd been alive all along, imprisoned just miles from where vigils had been held, searches had been conducted, families had grieved. Gina's parents, Felix and Nancy DeJesus, rushed to the hospital. The reunion was emotional beyond words. Nancy sobbed as she held her daughter for the first time in 9 years. Felix couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but hold Gina and cry. Their daughter was home. After all these years, after all the searching and hopping and praying, Gina was home. Amanda's reunion with her sister was equally emotional, but there was a bittersweet element to it. Amanda's mother, Lawana, wasn't there. She died in 2006, never knowing that Amanda was alive. The joy of being free was mixed with the grief of that loss, the knowledge that Amanda's mother had died of a broken heart just months before Jocelyn was born. Michelle Knight had no family waiting for her. Her mother didn't come to the hospital. There was no tearful reunion, no one holding her and thanking God she was alive. Michelle was alone again, just as she'd been when she disappeared. The system and even her own family had failed her twice, once when she was taken and again when she was rescued. But Michelle was strong. She'd survived 11 years of hell. She would survive this too. DNA tests were quickly conducted on Jocelyn to confirm what everyone already suspected. Ariel Castro was her biological father. The little girl who'd been visiting Castro's mother, who'd been taken to parks and driven around Cleveland, was the product of repeated assaults in captivity. Jocelyn had been born into a nightmare, but she was free now. And Amanda would make sure her daughter had the life she deserved. The escape on May 6, 2013, wasn't just the end of the captivity. It was the beginning of justice. Castro's crimes were about to be exposed to the world, and the three women he'd tried to destroy were about to show him just how strong they really were. While the three women were being evaluated at the hospital, law enforcement was moving fast. Ariel Castro had to be found and arrested before he realized what had happened, before he could run or destroy evidence. Officers were already at his house, securing the scene, beginning the process of documenting the horrors inside. Castro was located in the parking lot of a McDonald's not far from Seymour Avenue. He was eating, completely unaware that his world was about to come crashing down. When officers approached him and placed him under arrest, Castro seemed confused at first, but he knew. He had to know. After more than a decade of holding three women captive, he knew this day might come. Castro's brothers, Pedro and Ariel Castro, were also initially arrested. Police weren't sure at first if they were involved in the kidnappings. The three brothers lived near each other, and investigators needed to determine if this was a conspiracy or if Ariel had acted alone. After questioning and investigation, both Pedro and Ariel were cleared and released. They had no knowledge of what their brother had been doing. Ariel Castro had kept his crimes secret even from his own family. Back at 2207 Seymour Avenue, investigators were documenting one of the most disturbing crime scenes they'd ever encountered. The house was a nightmare. Chains still hung from the walls. Extension cords that had been used to bind the women were found throughout the house. The boards over the windows, the multiple locks on the doors, the alarms Castro had installed, everything painted a picture of a carefully constructed prison. Evidence bags were filled with items that told the story of the women's captivity. Diaries written on scraps of paper, clothing, personal items, the plastic kiddie pool where Jocelyn had been born, the chains and restraints Castro had used, the dumbbells he'd used to beat Michelle into miscarrying. Every piece of evidence was cataloged, photographed, preserved for the prosecution that everyone knew was coming. The medical examinations of the three women revealed the extent of the physical damage Castro had inflicted. Michelle had lost hearing in one ear from repeated blows to the head. Her facial bones had been fractured multiple times. She had scars covering her body. She was severely malnourished, weighing far less than she should. The doctors who examined her were shocked that she'd survived. Amanda and Gina also showed signs of long-term abuse, malnutrition, and trauma, but physically, they were in better condition than Michelle. Castro had focused the worst of his violence on Michelle, perhaps because nobody was looking for her, perhaps because he saw her as less valuable than the others. The differential treatment was its own form of cruelty. The women gave statements to police, recounting years of horror. Their testimony was detailed, consistent, and devastating. They described the kidnappings, the rapes, the beatings, the starvation, the forced miscarriages. They described being chained for days at a time, being suspended from the ceiling, being kept in darkness. They described watching Castro live a normal life, playing in bands, visiting family, while they were imprisoned just rooms away. Castro was initially charged with 4 counts of kidnapping and 3 counts of rape, but prosecutors knew these charges were just the beginning. As they reviewed the evidence, as they listened to the women's testimony, as they understood the full scope of Castro's crimes, they realized they needed to throw everything they had at him. Castro's first court appearance was on May 9, 2013, just 3 days after the rescue. He appeared via video link, refusing to make eye contact with the camera. His bail was set at $8 million, $2 million for each kidnapping victim and $2 million for Jocelyn. There was no way he was getting out. He would remain in jail until trial. Prosecutor Timothy McGinty announced that his office was considering seeking the death penalty against Castro. This was a capital case, McGinty said. The aggravated murder charges related to the forced miscarriages could carry the death penalty under Ohio law. Castro had intentionally caused the termination of pregnancies, and under the law, that was murder. The Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office began building what would become one of the most comprehensive indictments in American legal history. They reviewed every detail of the women's captivity, every assault, every beating, every day they were held against their will, and they calculated the charges accordingly. On July 12, 2013, a grand jury handed down a massive indictment against Ariel Castro, 977 counts. The number was staggering. It included 512 counts of kidnapping, 446 counts of SA, 7 counts of gross mistreatment of a corpse related to the forced miscarriages, and multiple counts of felonious assault. The indictment was 576 pages long, one of the largest criminal indictments in Ohio history. The charges related to the forced miscarriages were particularly significant. Castro was charged with aggravated murder, counts that carried the death penalty, for intentionally causing the termination of Michelle Knight's pregnancies. Prosecutors argued that by beating Michelle, by starving her, by deliberately causing her to miscarry, Castro had committed murder. Each forced miscarriage was a separate count of aggravated murder. The community reaction to the charges was overwhelming. People wanted justice. They wanted Castro to pay for what he'd done. Vigils were held for the survivors. Yellow ribbons, the symbol of hope and remembrance, appeared all over Cleveland. The women's strength and survival became a source of inspiration for the entire city. But as the case moved forward, a question emerged. Would this go to trial? The evidence was overwhelming. Castro had no real defense. The women's testimony, the physical evidence from the house, the DNA evidence proving he'd fathered Jocelyn, it all pointed to certain conviction. Castro's attorneys approached prosecutors about a possible plea deal. The women were consulted about the plea negotiations. Did they want to go through a trial? Did they want to testify in open court, reliving their trauma for a jury facing Castro again? Or would they accept a plea deal that would guarantee Castro would never be free again? The decision wasn't easy, but ultimately a plea deal was reached. Castro would plead guilty to 937 counts. In exchange, prosecutors would recommend a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 1,000 years. Castro would also agree to forfeiture of the house on Seymour Avenue and would never profit from his crimes. And most importantly, he would waive his right to appeal. This would be final. The death penalty was taken off the table, but Castro would still die in prison. He would never breathe free air again. He would spend the rest of his life locked in a cell, experiencing just a fraction of the captivity he'd inflicted on 3 innocent women. On July 26, 2013, Ariel Castro stood in court and pleaded guilty to 937 counts, including aggravated murder, kidnapping, and hundreds of counts of SA. He pleaded guilty to crimes that spanned more than a decade, crimes that had devastated 3 lives and traumatized an entire community. The plea hearing was emotional, tense, and at times surreal. As part of the plea agreement, Castro had to acknowledge what he'd done. He had to admit, in open court, to each category of crimes. He admitted to kidnapping Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Gina DeJesus. He admitted to repeatedly assaulting them. He admitted to the aggravated murder charges related to the forced miscarriages. Each admission was another nail in the coffin of any defense he might have tried to mount. Judge Michael Russo accepted the guilty pleas and scheduled sentencing for August 1, 2013. That sentencing hearing would become one of the most powerful moments in the entire case, a moment when the survivors would finally have their say, when they would confront the man who'd stolen so much from them. August 1, 2013, the courtroom was packed. Media from around the world were there to cover the sentencing. The families of the survivors filled the gallery, and most importantly, Michelle Knight was there, ready to deliver her victim impact statement. Amanda and Gina chose not to attend in person, but they submitted written statements to be read by prosecutors. Before sentencing, Castro himself was allowed to speak. What he said shocked everyone in the courtroom. Castro claimed he wasn't a violent person. He said he'd never beaten the women. He claimed the sex was consensual, that there was harmony in the house. He talked about his supposed sex addiction, as if that explained or excused anything. He blamed his behavior on childhood abuse and corn addiction. The audacity was stunning. The man who'd chained women to walls, who'd starved them, who'd beaten Michelle into 5 miscarriages, who'd held them captive for over a decade, was claiming the sex was consensual, that there was no violence. It was delusional, narcissistic, and offensive. But then it was Michelle Knight's turn to speak, and what she said would echo far beyond that courtroom. Michelle stood and faced Ariel Castro directly. This was the man who'd held her for 11 years, who'd tortured her, who'd nearly destroyed her, and she looked him in the eye and refused to be broken. "You took 11 years of my life away," Michelle said, her voice strong and clear. "I spent 11 years in hell. Now your hell is just beginning. I will overcome all this that happened, but you will face hell for eternity." She talked about the abuse she'd endured, the beatings, the starvation, the forced miscarriages. She talked about losing hearing in her ear, about the permanent damage he'd caused. And then she said something that showed just how strong she really was. "I can forgive you, but I will never forget," Michelle said. She talked about how she'd survived because she had hope, because she refused to let him win. "You took my life, but you don't own me anymore. I own my life." The courtroom was silent except for the sound of people crying. Michelle's strength, her refusal to remain a victim, her determination to reclaim her life, was inspiring and heartbreaking all at once. She'd survived hell, and she was standing there telling her abuser that he hadn't won, that she was stronger than he ever could be. Amanda Berry's statement was read aloud. She talked about being taken the day before her 17th birthday, about missing her mother's death, about giving birth in captivity. She talked about raising Jocelyn in that house of horrors, about doing everything she could to protect her daughter from the worst of it. And she thanked the people who'd helped her escape, who'd believed her when she said she was Amanda Berry, who'd saved her life. Gina DeJesus' statement focused on her family, on the pain her disappearance had caused them, on the years they'd spent searching for her. She talked about being betrayed by someone she trusted, about the trauma of captivity, about the long road to recovery ahead. But she also talked about hope, about moving forward, about reclaiming the life Castro had stolen. Judge Russo then delivered Castro's sentence: life without parole plus 1,000 years. Castro would spend the rest of his life in prison. He would never be released. He would die behind bars. The sentence was the maximum possible under the plea agreement, and Judge Russo made it clear that Castro deserved every day of it. "You have extreme narcissism, and it seems rather pervasive," Judge Russo told Castro. "I'm not sure there is anyone who can give you a greater sentence than the sentence you have imposed on yourself." The house on Seymour Avenue was forfeited to the county. It would be demolished, erased from the landscape as if it had never existed. Castro would never profit from his crimes. He would die in obscurity, forgotten, while the women he'd tried to destroy went on to reclaim their lives. As Castro was led out of the courtroom, back to prison to begin serving his sentence, Michelle Knight had the last word. She looked at him and said simply, "Your hell is just beginning." She was right. Ariel Castro was transferred to the Correctional Reception Center in Orient, Ohio, to begin serving his life sentence. The prison was a high-security facility, and Castro was placed in protective custody. Prison officials knew that inmates don't look kindly on people who hurt women and children. Castro would be a target if he was placed in the general population. Castro adjusted to prison life, or so it seemed. He ate his meals, followed the rules, kept to himself. Guards checked on him regularly as part of the protective custody protocol. He was supposed to be monitored closely, given the high-profile nature of his case and the length of his sentence. But on the night of September 3, 2013, just 1 month into his sentence, Ariel Castro was found dead in his cell. Guards discovered him hanging from a window, bedsheets tied around his neck in an apparent self-deletion. He was pronounced dead shortly after being found. The man who'd held 3 women captive for over a decade, who'd tortured and brutalized them, was gone. The news of Castro's death sent shockwaves through Cleveland and beyond. Some people felt cheated, believing that Castro had taken the easy way out, that he'd escaped the years of suffering his sentence was supposed to inflict. Others felt relief that the women would never have to worry about him again, that they could heal without the knowledge that he was still out there, alive, breathing. An investigation was immediately launched into Castro's death. How had he been able to hang himself while in protective custody? Where were the guards? Why wasn't he on stricter suicide watch given the circumstances? Questions swirled about whether prison officials had been negligent. The autopsy confirmed that Castro died by hanging. There were no signs of foul play. It was ruled a self-deletion. But the investigation into the circumstances continued. The Ohio State Highway Patrol conducted a thorough review of the prison's procedures and the events leading up to Castro's death. 2 corrections officers were placed on paid administrative leave pending the investigation. The review found that while the officers hadn't followed all protocols exactly, they weren't grossly negligent. Castro had been checked on regularly, though perhaps not as frequently as he should have been given his high-profile status. The investigation concluded that Castro had taken advantage of a window of opportunity between checks to end his life. Some investigators found notes in Castro's cell, writings that seemed to indicate he'd been planning this. Castro wrote about his crimes, about his regrets, though even in death he seemed more concerned with his own suffering than the pain he'd inflicted on others. The notes were self-pitying, narcissistic, focused on how terrible prison was for him rather than acknowledging the horror he'd put 3 women through. The 3 survivors had mixed reactions to news of Castro's death. For some, there was a sense of relief. He was gone. He could never hurt them again. They would never have to worry about him appealing his conviction, never have to worry about some legal technicality setting him free. He was gone, and that part of their nightmare was truly over. But there was also frustration. Castro had escaped justice in a way. He'd served just 1 month of his life sentence, 1 month out of what should have been decades of punishment. He died on his own terms, making his own choice, something he'd never allowed his victims to do. It felt unfair, incomplete. Michelle Knight, speaking publicly about Castro's death, said she was glad he was gone but wished he could have suffered more. He took the easy way out, she said. The man who'd put her through 11 years of hell had spent just 30 days in prison before ending his own life. The disparity was stark. The prison system faced criticism over Castro's death. How could such a high-profile inmate, someone who should have been monitored closely, manage to hang himself? What did this say about the safety and security of Ohio's prisons? Reforms were promised, protocols were reviewed, but it didn't change what had happened. For the women Castro had victimized, life went on. They had to find a way to heal, to rebuild, to reclaim the years that had been stolen from them. Castro's death didn't erase what he'd done. It didn't give them back their lost time, but it did mean they could move forward without him casting a shadow over their recovery. The rescue on May 6, 2013, wasn't the end of Michelle Knight's, Amanda Berry's, and Gina DeJesus' stories. It was the beginning of a long, difficult journey toward healing and reclaiming their lives. Each woman faced unique challenges, unique paths forward, but all 3 showed remarkable strength and resilience. Michelle Knight had the longest, hardest road ahead. She'd been in captivity for 11 years, longer than the others. She'd endured the worst of Castro's violence. And unlike Amanda and Gina, she had no family support waiting for her. When she was rescued, her mother didn't come to the hospital. There was no tearful reunion, no one holding her and welcoming her home. Michelle had to rebuild her life essentially from scratch. She had no home to return to, no family to lean on, no support system. But she refused to remain a victim. She changed her name to Lily Rose Lee. shedding the name that connected her to her painful past and embracing a new identity. She wrote a book, Finding Me, A Decade of Darkness, A Life Reclaimed, published in 2014. In it, she detailed her captivity, the abuse she endured, and her journey toward healing. The book was raw, honest, and difficult to read, but it was also a testament to human resilience. Michelle didn't sugarcoat anything. She told her truth, all of it. Michelle also had to come to terms with the loss of her son, Joey. Joey had been adopted while Michelle was in captivity. He was a teenager now, living his own life with his adoptive family. Michelle made the difficult decision not to disrupt his life, to let him grow up without the burden of knowing about her ordeal. She watches from a distance, respecting his life while grieving the relationship they'll never have. Michelle became an advocate for missing persons and victims of abuse. She speaks publicly about her experience, not to relive the trauma, but to help others. She works with organizations that support survivors of violence and advocates for better responses to missing persons cases, especially for people like her who don't fit the perfect victim narrative that gets media attention. Her strength is extraordinary. She survived 11 years of hell, emerged with no support system, and built a life for herself anyway. She refuses to let Castro's crimes define her. She's Lily Rose Lee now, a survivor, an advocate, a woman who refused to be broken. Amanda Berry had family waiting for her, but her mother's death cast a shadow over her freedom. Lawana Miller had died in 2006, heartbroken, never knowing Amanda was alive. That loss is something Amanda will carry forever. She missed her mother's death, missed the chance to say goodbye, missed years they should have had together. But Amanda had Jocelyn, and that little girl became her focus. Amanda was determined to give Jocelyn the childhood she deserved, to protect her from the trauma of her birth, to create a normal, loving life for her daughter. And she succeeded. Jocelyn, who's now a teenager, knows her story but isn't defined by it. Amanda made sure of that. Amanda also wrote a book, co-authoring Hope, a memoir of survival in Cleveland, with Gina DeJesus in 2015. The book told their stories, their captivity, their escape, their recovery. It was a bestseller, reaching readers around the world who were inspired by their survival and strength. Amanda works in victim advocacy now. She uses her experience to help other survivors, to advocate for better resources for victims of violence and abduction. She's become a voice for the voiceless, using her platform to create change. Her reunion with her family, especially her sister, was emotional and ongoing. They're rebuilding their relationships, finding their way back to each other after years apart. It's not always easy. Amanda missed formative years, experiences she can never get back. But she's with her family again, and she's creating new memories to replace the ones that were stolen. Gina DeJesus returned to a family that had never stopped searching for her. Her parents, Felix and Nancy, had spent 9 years organizing searches, holding vigils, keeping Gina's name in the news. When Gina came home, it was everything they'd prayed for. But coming home wasn't simple. Gina had been taken at 14 and returned at 23. She'd missed her entire adolescence, her high school years, her transition to adulthood. The world had changed while she was gone. Technology had advanced. Friends had grown up, gone to college, started careers. Gina had to navigate all of this while also processing the trauma of what she'd endured. Gina, like Amanda, co-authored the book Hope. Writing it was therapeutic, a way to process what had happened and reclaim her narrative. The book tour, the interviews, the public appearances, they were all part of her healing process, a way to take control of her story. Gina has focused on education and advocacy. She earned her high school diploma and has worked with organizations that support missing children and victims of violence. She's turned her pain into purpose, using her experience to help prevent others from suffering as she did. The relationship between Gina and her friend Ariel Castro, Ariel's daughter, was complicated and painful. Arlene was devastated to learn what her father had done, especially that he'd used her as bait to lure Gina into the car. That betrayal, that manipulation, damaged their friendship irreparably. But both women have worked to move forward, to not let Ariel Castro destroy more than he already had. All three women have become symbols of survival and resilience. Their escape and recovery have inspired countless people around the world. They've shown that even after the worst imaginable trauma, healing is possible, that life can go on, that strength can be found in the darkest places. The impact of their case extends beyond their personal stories. The Cleveland kidnappings led to changes in how missing persons cases are handled, especially for adults who might not fit the typical profile. There's more awareness now that anyone can be a victim, that we need to take all disappearances seriously. The case also highlighted the importance of community vigilance. How had three women been held captive in a residential neighborhood for over a decade without anyone realizing? The answer is uncomfortable. People heard things, saw things, suspected things, but didn't act. The case became a reminder that if you see something, say something, and don't stop pushing until someone listens. Today, Michelle, Amanda, and Gina are living their lives on their own terms. They're no longer defined by what happened to them. They're survivors, advocates, mothers, daughters, friends. They're living proof that even the worst evil can be overcome, that the human spirit is stronger than the forces that try to break it. Their message to other survivors is simple. You are not alone, you are not broken, and you are stronger than you know. They've turned their trauma into a force for good, helping others find their own paths to healing and justice. The Ariel Castro kidnappings will forever be remembered as one of the most horrific crimes in American history. But thanks to Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Gina DeJesus, it will also be remembered as a story of survival, of strength, of three women who refused to let evil win. They walked out of that house on May 6, 2013, and they kept walking forward into lives they built for themselves, lives filled with hope, purpose, and the knowledge that they survived. They more than survived, they triumphed.